This little subgenre of games doesn't really have a proper formal, genre name or whatever. Generally, people call these boss rush games, but that doesn't really fit to me. When I think of a boss rush, I think of, Mega Man, where, you fight all the bosses, but then at the end of the game, you fight them all in one go. That's the rush part of it. But it's not like in any of these games you're fighting like a gauntlet of bosses all at once. It's just a game where the main focus is fighting bosses. So I feel like we should call them like boss battlers or something, but whatever. Point is, we're talking about boss fighting games in this video, as there are quite a number of very cool ones out there. And at first I'm going to talk about the very well-known generalized ones just to get them out of the way, but stick around, I have some hidden gems in there that you've probably never heard of before. But first, let's get started with Cuphead. Do I even need to talk about this game? It's Cuphead. Everyone knows about it. I guess what I will say is that I actually only just recently played Cuphead for the first time, because for a long time I just wasn't really that interested in the game. Which I'm sure to many people is going to be like, what the heck, Pariah? How on earth did you sleep on Cuphead? It's amazing, it's so good, it looks like a 1930s cartoon. And of course, I've heard all the positive reception toward this game, but truthfully, I was kinda skeptical about it, because Cuphead really didn't look like anything that special to me. It looked like a very standard, 2D run-and-gun, Contra-style game. And it looked perfectly good, but it didn't look like anything stand out or anything that you have to play. The big draw for this game was its visuals, the fact that it's super well animated and that it's got its very unique style, especially for video games. I mean, that was the whole thing when the game was first shown off, and when it came out, people were just going crazy talking about how gorgeous this game was, and that really dominated the conversation, and it made me, with my cynical attitude, wonder if that was the reason that everybody cared about Cuphead. And honestly, I still think that's probably the case for most people. Because remember back when the game first came out, there was all that discussion about, oh my god, the game's so hard, blah blah blah. I suspect that a lot of that happened because for the majority of people, no one actually cared about Cuphead the video game. I don't think anyone cared about Cuphead the run-and-gun difficult boss battler. People cared about Cuphead, the game that looks like a 1930s cartoon, and really, I think Cuphead could have been almost anything and got nearly the exact same level of praise. Could have been a platformer, it could have been a Metroidvania, it could have been like a top-down Zelda-style game. As long as it was pretty good and it had the same visual style, I think that this game would have gotten almost the exact same amount of praise that it got when it came out. Similarly, I'd be willing to bet that if Cuphead was the exact same game in terms of gameplay and design, but didn't look like a 1930s cartoon, like it's not Cuphead, instead it's like a typical science fiction pixel art looking indie game, no one would have paid this game any attention. All anyone cares about Cuphead are the visuals, and yes, the visuals are very nice, but that is not going to get me to fall in love with a game. Needs to be a solid game, needs to be really well designed, really fun, really cool, really interesting. And yeah, looking at Cuphead, I saw something that was pretty bog standard, so I was just kind of like, whatever. But I eventually finally did pick it up and play it, and yeah, it is pretty by the books, but it is incredibly well executed. Thanks to the developers choosing to make this game quite difficult, these boss designs and their attack patterns are not messing around. You really gotta be on the ball to avoid all these things. And there are so many bosses in this game that I feel they do a really good job of exploring the kinds of attack patterns you can throw at the player in a 2D platformer style game like this. Just hitboxes all over the place in every kind of arrangement you can think of, multiple attacks coming at you that you need to avoid all at once, forcing you to not just think about how you're going to avoid this thing, but how that's going to set you up to avoid the next thing, and weave between all these things at once. It's some very cool stuff. And while mechanically the game is fairly simple, there is enough here that keeps you mindful, keeps you thinking. You know, you got your meter, your cards there in the bottom left, and you can spend those for either EX moves or save it up for a super. And that has some invincibility frames on it, so you can use it at the right time to not only deal a bunch of damage, but also avoid certain attacks. You got the parries, which will give you a card, so that's something to go out of your way to try to do when you can, but if you get greedy with it, then you might end up taking a bunch of hits. You got your 2 different weapon types to switch between to optimize your damage dealing for different situations. You have making your build to begin with, you know, what weapons you want to use, what supers, what perks, all of that's really cool. Though I will say, my one major criticism for Cuphead, I think a lot of the options that they offer to you are really unbalanced. Like, some of the tools and some of the weapons are clearly just way better than others. The one that really stands out to me is the smoke bomb, giving you an invincible dash. That is given to you right at the beginning of the game, and it's so insanely powerful, it makes the game way easier. And at the same time, there were a lot of things in the shop that I was like, don't need that, that's not good, that's not worth equipping, that's not worth buying, so definitely some balance issues there, I'd say. The only other things that I would, like, kind of criticize about this game, but not really, is the run-and-gun stages are perfectly good, but I do feel that they're not as strong as the bosses. Apparently this game was originally not going to have these stages, but people expected that kind of thing from a game like this, so developers added that later into development, and that makes a lot of sense because they do feel a bit out of place in my opinion. Like, I'm glad they went for the design they did, focusing on bosses, because I feel if this game was more traditional, focused on levels like these, then it wouldn't be as strong as it is. And the other thing that's very much just a personal gripe and down to preference, I'm not as much a fan of the plane levels compared to the on-foot levels. Find that the on-foot stages are more interesting because you gotta worry about jumping and you get your weapons and loadouts and stuff, whereas the plane levels are more of a traditional shmup and it's just kinda move around things. You know, you still have weapon switching and you can go into that dodge mode where you're smaller and faster, but I just don't find it to be overall as engaging as the on-foot bosses. But like I said, those are very, very minor things, not even really criticisms. Cuphead is a great game. It's not just, oh, look at it, it's visually amazing, it's like a 1930s cartoon, the music. Put all that aside and look at it as a video game, and it is, in fact, fantastic. Not to say that I don't appreciate the visuals of Cuphead, the game is obviously gorgeous, especially the DLC. I feel like they really upped the animation quality for that, like some of those bosses are like crazy good looking there. But personally, I'm not like especially a fan of old school like 1930s style cartoons. I have no love for that era of animation or anything. But I do love me some hand-drawn video games, you know, stuff like Streets of Rage 4, like, I think we absolutely need more of that in video games, and you can't deny how incredibly good Cuphead looks. One last thing I want to mention. I figured this game would be mostly influenced by Contra. That seemed to be the kind of thing it was going for, but I was really pleasantly surprised to see that its bigger point of reference seems to be treasure games, like Gunstar Heroes and Alien Soldier. There are a lot of direct references to treasure stuff in this game, which, as a big fan of their stuff, that was really cool. Freedom Planet's in good company. Moving on from one game everyone already knows to another, we have Monster Hunter, which, similar to Cuphead, is a game that I've just gotten into very recently. I've never played a Monster Hunter game before, just never really got around to it. It's a series that always interested me, but the Wilds beta was going on recently, and I figured, why don't I give it a try? And yeah, I see why this is such a big deal for so many people. This is really fun. This is more first impressions than anything, as the beta is only a tiny sliver of what a full Monster Hunter game is, but already I'm having a lot of fun with it. Ever since World came out, I've been interested in giving the series a try, but I just never got around to it because of a couple of things that I'd either seen or heard about the games that kinda had me a little bit worried. One of the things that we'll see how I feel about it when I actually start playing a full Monster Hunter game, I hear that these are basically grinding the game, you know, fighting monsters over and over and over to collect parts for random drops, to like build your gear and level up so you can fight tougher monsters, and that kind of thing I absolutely hate in games. I hate like random drops and grinding to try to get the materials you need and all that stupid crap. So hearing that that's like the core gameplay loop of Monster Hunter was not very exciting to me. And when I looked at gameplay footage of the games, it never really grabbed me as like, oh man, that looks sick, I gotta play that. Because watching it, it looks like you got like kind of Souls-esque, like kind of slow-paced, heavier combat. But like watching the monsters do their thing, it looked like they didn't attack that frequently, and the game looked very like kind of clunky to me. It still looked good, but it looked like I could get a similar but more fast and intense and cool experience playing a more traditional action game. So I was just like, I'll try out Monster Hunter one of these days. But now that I've actually played it, I see how it all kind of comes together and works. Because, yeah, the monsters don't attack as frequently as like a Souls boss or something like that. And the fact that you got a party of dudes fighting it means that its attention is only on you some of the time, so sometimes you don't even have to worry about dodging. But I think the thing that makes it work out is that these fights are real endurance challenges. These monsters have a lot of health, and these hunts can go on for quite a while, like upwards of 10, 20, maybe even 30 minutes in some cases. And that being the case, it makes sense that the fights aren't as intense, because if you had high-octane, like, Ninja Gaiden fights that went on for 30 minutes, that would be incredibly draining and really difficult. So instead of this 2 or 3 minute long fight that's really intense, you get a slightly more drawn out experience, but that ends up working out really well to its favor, because it almost feels like a more chill and laid back action game to me that really, I think, helps out the co-op aspect of things. Because as someone that's very used to, like, super difficult, super in-depth, fast-paced action games, I felt myself not having to put in as much work playing Monster Hunter that I do in, say, a Bayonetta or something. And that meant it was a lot better for chilling with my friends. You know, playing it solo or with randos online was fun, but definitely the best time I had playing Monster Hunter was with friends, shooting the shit, talking about whatever, and, you know, being engaged with the fight, but not being, like, full 100% focus mode. That really wasn't necessary. And of course, this is just a beta. This is easy level stuff. I'm sure that in actual full games, when you get to the later game stuff, it probably does get more intense and difficult, but at least what I've played so far, I feel like it's a really good, laid-back, chill-with-your-friends kind of game. One thing that stood out to me about Monster Hunter that I really liked is, while it does have, like, perfect dodges and perfect guards, you know, if they do the attack and you hit the button right as you should, then you get, like, this special effect or whatever. But because so many of the attacks in this game are, like, so huge and so damaging, I, at least for now, have felt that it's far more effective to just physically get out of the way of the monster attacks than trying to iframe through everything. And I appreciated that, because I feel like that's a really over-prevalent design we see in action games, especially these days. Like, every single game has a parry and an invincible dodge, and just watch the attack tails, press the button at the right time, and the whole game basically boils down to that. So playing a game where you have this giant beast reeling up this huge attack, you're just like, get out of the way! That was quite different from most of what I've been playing lately. Who knows, maybe as I get better at the game I will start doing that kind of thing, but at least for now, I like where I'm at. And when it comes to the mechanics, I was pleasantly surprised to see that the different weapon types had more to them than I expected going into Monster Hunter. They're not just, like, different movesets of different kinds of hitboxes or whatever, you know, like, this weapon's the fast weapon, this one is the slow, damaging weapon. And so far from what I've tested, at least, they've all got some kind of extra system mechanic that sets them apart from all the other weapons. Like the bow, for example, you have these flare shots that you can put on the monster, and then all your shots will home in on those points and deal enough damage to them, and they'll detonate and do a whole bunch of extra damage, so you want to, like, put as many of those targets as you can on the monster, and then set them all off. Or the charge blade, you have it in sword and shield mode, and you build up a meter that you can then use to power up your shield or your sword, or even when you switch into the axe mode, you can power all those things up and spend that meter, so it has you switching back and forth, trying to optimize your use of the resources. It's all really cool. I did not know there was that level of depth to the weapons in these games, and I'm excited to mess around with more weapon types and see what else they got going on. And the monsters themselves are incredibly impressive, like super well modeled, really great designs, but their animations and behaviors are really spectacular to me. Like, they move and act like real creatures in so many regards. They have all kinds of different behaviors that they'll do. If you just, like, leave them alone, they'll, like, go for food or drink or sleep, they'll attack each other. It's really impressive, man. Like, it really does kind of fulfill that fantasy of having this world filled with all these giant, powerful creatures, and you're fighting them. It doesn't feel like it's an enemy in a video game, you know? It feels like that's a frickin' dragon. One thing I will say I do not like about the Monster Hunter experience so far, I personally feel this is absolutely way too complicated. I feel there's a lot of superfluous mechanics and features here that don't really add to the fun, they just add more things to the game. Like sharpness, I think that's just stupid, or like the whole food cooking thing to get all these buffs, like is that really necessary? When you pull up the menu stuff, you got like a right stick radial menu, and then you have the D-pad to switch between all these different radial menus, and you can use the face buttons to switch between 2 other menus of different things. You have all these consumable items you can use. You can throw like explosive barrels and traps and like camouflage and a fishing rod, and like, there's too much stuff here. I'm sure longtime fans are into all this, and that's not even getting into like the weapon crafting and the stats and all that stuff that's gonna come in the full game, I'm sure. And I'm just like, man, I just want to fight cool monsters. That's all I care about. You don't need all this superfluous stuff to achieve that. And for my own personal taste, I'd prefer a game that was a lot more streamlined, but it's fun enough that I'm willing to put up with it, you know, similar to like all the annoying stuff in Dark Souls. So yeah, overall, I've been having a lot of fun with Monster Hunter. Probably gonna pick up Wilds. Probably gonna pick up World and Rise at some point as well. They got me. I'm in. I'm trying to get all my friends into it. Don't know how I'm gonna fit time in my life for Monster Hunter, because I hear these games are massive time sinks, but we'll see. Anyway, let's move on to some lesser-known games, eh? And of course, we can't talk about boss fight in video games without talking a bit about Punch-Out, but everyone knows about Punch-Out. Everyone knows those games are super cool. But it's been a long time since they made a Punch-Out game, not since the one on the Wii. So how about we talk about Thunder Ray, an indie game heavily inspired by Punch-Out. And yeah, it's basically just a Punch-Out game. But it has some interesting, unique choices, I find, that I quite like. Maybe even a bit more so than Punch-Out in some cases. But I guess the basics for anyone not familiar with Punch-Out, these games are all about identifying and reacting. The boss has a bunch of attacks they're gonna do, and it's up to you to look at their attack tells and figure out what they're gonna do and then dodge accordingly. They'll do a big wide swipe and you have to duck under that, or they'll do an uppercut on the right side, you have to dodge to the left. Some attacks you can't dodge at all, you have to just block them. So it's all about paying attention, learning how the bosses attack, how they work, and then finding your opportunities to get hits in between their attacks. And for me, that's where Thunder Ray is a little different and slightly more interesting than a lot of Punch-Out games, because in Punch-Out you can rarely just like throw out punches and deal damage to the other fighters. Most of the time, they're just gonna block whatever you do, except for special circumstances. So Punch-Out is mostly just like, sit there, watch the boss dodge attacks, get in a couple hits after avoiding something. Whereas here in Thunder Ray, the fighters actually rarely have vulnerability periods after avoiding their attacks. Instead, you can kind of just throw out hits, and you'll get a decent number of them through. Which at first felt a little bit weird, like I was basically just kind of mashing buttons to deal damage, but eventually I started to realize that it's kind of a really good system here. Because in Punch-Out, like I said, most of the time you're just sitting there waiting for the boss to attack. Here, because you're going on the offensive, that can act as a distraction and make you not ready for when the boss does their thing. If you're going wild focusing on your own attacks, then you might not react as quickly to the enemy's attacks as opposed to when you're just standing there waiting for it, so there's a little bit of risk-reward there. You know, do you want to go on the offense and maybe risk that they might throw out an attack and you won't see it coming? But also Thunder Ray has both standard attacks and heavy attacks you can do that have a little bit more commitment to them. If you throw one out at the wrong time, the boss might attack at the same time as you and you'll get hit. So it's again, risk-reward. When do you want to try to find the opportunities to fit those in? And while it might seem kind of random that you're just like throwing out attacks and the boss is going to attack when they attack, you don't know when it is, there is actually a rhythm to it that you can feel out. If you keep attacking the boss relentlessly, then eventually they're going to do a counterattack. You see a little pop-up that says counter, and that's when they do some sort of special, usually more difficult sequence that they throw at you specifically because you've been attacking non-stop. And while you can be ready for these counters and just avoid them like anything else, I found, especially against the harder fights later in the game, that the most effective strategy was to actually avoid being countered at all by doing some attacks, but then stopping just before I feel like I'm about to trigger a counter, because it feels like it comes after like 6 to 10 hits or something like that. And I found with a lot of the fights, if you give the opponent some breathing room after you do a couple of punches and you stop, that's usually when they're going to throw out one of their more basic attacks that makes them easier to deal with. So again, you have a risk-reward factor there. Do you just want to go nuts and just deal with the counters, or do you want to play more carefully? This game actually has a bit more strategy than I find Punch-Out usually does, and you also have your super meter there that you can build up to 3 levels for different supers that deal more damage, so you want to resource manage and get the most out of your meter that you can. I gotta say, Thunder Ray is a really solid Punch-Out style game. Like, I'd say overall it feels like it's on par with the quality of official Punch-Out. The only thing about this game that I feel is a really big missed opportunity is it doesn't use the different attack areas as much as Punch-Out does. Like, Punch-Out has some fighters where, like, their face is their weak spot, and because of that, they always block high attacks. But if you punch them first in the gut, they shift to a low block, and then you can get some high punches in. Thunder Ray doesn't really have anything like that. There's no distinction between punching in the gut or the face, doesn't really do anything. None of the bosses have any preference for blocking one way or another. It's kind of just arbitrary, which is really weird. Outside of that, I don't like how much mashing there is in the game. Either when you get down or the opponent gets down, you mash A to refill your health, and that is annoying because you do it a lot here. That's the same problem Punch-Out has. And I also hate the thing they do when you get to low health in this game, where the camera blows the color out and it zooms in a bunch and gets really blurry. And I get it's supposed to be like, you know, your fighters on their last legs and they can't really focus as well, but from a game perspective, it sucks, and I hate it. Outside of that, though, I think it's a really solid game. Nice art, nice animation. Word of warning, though, for some people, this might be a total turnoff for them. Apparently, the voices in this game are all AI generated. They didn't get any voice actors for it. I didn't know that until after I had played the game. So for some people, that might be a total no-go. I'm not a big fan of that, but it doesn't stop the gameplay from being really fun, so I'll tolerate it, I guess? I don't know. I gotta figure out how I feel about AI-generated stuff in games. But now we move on to a real hidden gem. This is a game that I think is totally flown under the radar, and that's a crying shame because it's really sick. This is Punch-A-Bunch, another boxing-themed game, and as you can see, it's a very goofy game. But here's the thing, behind this silly and kind of low-budget looking exterior is something really unique and really awesome. This is not a Punch-Out style game. It doesn't play anything like it, and as a matter of fact, believe it or not, this game is probably the best realistic simulation of actual fighting I've ever played. Because here's how it works. You got one attack button in this game, and you can either tap to do light attacks or hold to do heavy attacks. But the real rub here is that with the right stick, you can tilt your character's body left and right. And that determines what kind of punch you're going to do when you press the attack button. If you're leaning to the right and you attack, you'll punch with your right hand. If you're leaning to the left, you'll attack with your left hand. And if you lean forward, then you'll aim low for body shots. But the really cool thing about this game is it doesn't use traditional attacks like most action games. It's all physics-based, so when you throw a punch, the thing that determines how damaging it is how fast your fist is moving when it hits the enemy. And just like real fighting, the way to give your punches the most strength possible is to lean into your punches. So if you attack from the right side, as you throw it, shift your weight over to the left side, and that'll put way more speed into your punch and make it do way more damage. And that's just so cool and unique and gives this game a totally different feel than anything I've ever played before, where you're shifting your weight around, throwing out these punches, not just trying to land hits, but make sure those are good, clean hits like you do in an actual fight. And because you're controlling where you punch with the right stick, not only do you want to get a good solid punch, but you want to make sure that it connects properly. You know, you want to really hit him in the face or really hit him in the gut. It adds that layer of real-life precision that I've never seen another game simulate before. You know, when you throw out a punch, you gotta aim for the guy and actually hit him. It's such a cool combat system. I was really impressed by this game. I think it's made by a solo developer. Insanely awesome. Like, I've played so many action games, and way too many of them are all the same thing over and over. Been there, done that. You know, you got light attacks and heavy attacks and a parry and an iframe dodge, and you just kinda do the same thing in every single game out there. So coming to this game and not knowing how to effectively fight because it's so unlike anything I've ever played before, I had to formulate what a good strategy to fighting in this game is because I had no grounding to base it off of. outside of like my own real experience, like someone with a swordsmanship background, once I started to get my footing in this game, I was like, huh, I wonder if I do a dash as I throw out a punch, that should make me go even faster and put my entire body weight into my punch, so that should make it do more damage, right? And I don't even know if that actually works, but the fact that I'm using my own real-life knowledge to inform my strategy in this game is so cool. And all the opponents you fight in this game are really great. Obviously, they have their gimmicks and their own unique, like, special moves or whatever they have to learn how to deal with. But also, they just have different strategies. Some will just, like, throw out hits relentlessly. Some will wait to try to counterattack you. Some will just kind of throw out hits without really caring very much about the consequences. Learning how to deal with all of them, again, I just can't get over how much it felt like real fighting stuff. Like, throwing out some high punches to get them to block high, and then go for some low gut punches. And it's like, bro, this game is so awesome. What the heck? And the fact that you're using the right stick to drive these attacks, it just adds to the tactile feeling that really makes it feel kind of immersive in a way, because when you do that right to left punch, you move your thumb with it, and it feels like you're throwing your weight into it too. And like, you can feel in your thumb when you throw out a good punch, and when it connects, it's so satisfying. Like, honestly, the biggest compliment I could give this game is it's kind of made me want to give boxing a try, because this is so fun. Super underrated game. Punch-a-Bunch, definitely give it a try. It is totally worth your time. Now we have what is probably my favorite game in this video, Furi, spelled F-U-R-I. This here is a top-down twin-stick shooter, which is a fairly common style for these kinds of like boss fight focus games. But Furi, in my opinion, stands head and shoulders above the rest of them for a number of reasons. One of them being that it's not just a twin-stick bullet hell style game, there's also melee combat in here. But another big factor that makes Furi so cool is its really interesting overall design and structure to the fights. These fights are really long. Remember what I was talking about before with Monster Hunter, how they're really long fights so they're not as intense? Furi kinda doesn't do that. These fights are probably gonna be at least 6 minutes in most cases, but some of them can easily be over 15. But they are really fast-paced and intense and really challenging. And that obviously can make these fights very demanding, but they have a really good system here to prevent it from being overly so. If you look in the top corners, you have my health bar on the left and the boss health bar on the right, but under that are those pips, and that basically functions as a life, both for me and the boss. So as the player, you get 3 lives, and the boss gets as many as they have phases. Every time you take down one of those pips, it kind of shifts the fight into the next phase, where they're going to introduce new attacks and change up the way they fight. But these aren't just lives, they function more like rounds, almost like it's a fighting game. Once someone wins the round, whether it be the player or the boss, both of the health bars completely reset going into the next round. So if you win, then you get your health refilled, but if the boss wins, you have to start the current phase over again and do it in one go. And while the boss gets more rounds than the player does, if you're down a pip and you win a round against the boss, then you get a pip back. So you actually can have more than just 3 attempts here. And it ends up ultimately feeling like it's kind of a fighting game. Like, this is a one-on-one, fair, even fight with you and the boss going at each other, and the first one to win however many rounds wins the match. What I really like about this system is it gives the player wiggle room and time to learn stuff and make mistakes without necessarily being punished for it. If you go into a new phase you've never fought before, but you have 3 lives, then you can lose a round and then win the round on your second attempt, and you'll have 3 lives going into the next phase. So you have a whole life there that you can basically burn, learning the enemy attacks and how they fight and how to beat them. And if you end up down like 2 lives, but then you win this round, you go back up to 2, and then you win the next round without losing, and then you go back up to 3. So you can come back from behind in these fights. And it makes it feel like even if they go on for a long time, it's kind of compartmentalized in a way that really gives you a fighting chance, but because you have the cap of 3, it means you can't go into the last round with like 8 lives and make it almost a guarantee that you'll get it eventually. It's a really cool, unique system that I think works really well. And again, it really brings across that feeling that you are on even footing with these bosses. You know, so many games the player is like way more powerful than what they're fighting, or it could even be vice versa. But here, you're playing by pretty much the same rules that the boss is, so it's really just whoever fights better wins. It's very cool. And the fights themselves are also impeccably designed and very unique. There are a lot of different kinds of attacks in this game that you have to avoid in different ways. You do have that little dash that you see in a lot of action games like this, but interestingly, it doesn't give you any iframes. You can dodge through attacks, but that's only because you don't actually travel the distance. You effectively just teleport to your destination. But without iframes, there are certain attacks that you just cannot avoid. For example, these circular attacks that the bosses throw out, you have to get into the gap where they're not going to hit. And you can't time a dash to avoid the hit when it comes out. That's not going to work. You have to go to the opening. And while you do have a parry in this game, that too is not effective against a lot of the attack types. It works for melee attacks and some projectiles, but many things it's not going to work on. So you have these different ways of avoiding attacks, and you have to use the right one for the right situation. Some things you have to dash through, some things you have to parry, some things you just need to steer around and avoid. What really makes this game come together is the really creative attack patterns that the bosses throw at you. I've never seen attacks like this in any other game. The enemies have a lot of different attack types. They have basic projectiles, but they also have lasers that they can shoot out for a sustained attack, and they can move those around. You have these big waves that they shoot out that you have to dash through. They have these dangerous floors that can move around in all kinds of different ways. You have melee attacks, you have those circle attacks I mentioned before. And this game, if you haven't figured it out so far just by watching the gameplay, can be really difficult, where they throw out 2, 3, 4 of these different kinds of attacks at the player all at once, and you need to avoid multiple of them at the same time in different ways, while also trying to find opportunities to get damage in yourself. I feel like the gameplay speaks for itself. I mean, some of the attack patterns here are crazy. I've never seen anything like this. And yeah, this game is not for the faint of heart. Even on the normal difficulty, it's pretty brutal, and when you beat that, you unlock Furier mode, which is like the second playthrough harder difficulty, which basically is just more of the game. All the bosses get way harder. Like, it's not just damage increases. They get totally different attacks. They're basically entirely different fights. While the base game is already pretty challenging, it ultimately still kind of ends up feeling like it's the tutorial, and Furier is the real game where they take their gloves off and go, alright, let's see if you can handle this. So if you're one who likes a challenge, Furi is totally sick. Awesome action game, very unique, really stylish and cool. All the bosses and like your character has a cool design. All the different bosses have their different gimmicks and stuff. Some are more melee oriented, some of them are more projectile oriented. Music is really cool in this game, just all around a really solid package. The developers, the game bakers, they are a team to keep an eye on, because they know what they're doing. Now, I did say that Furi might be my favorite game in this list, so you might think I should have saved it for last. Weird to have one final game after my favorite. But the reason I did that is because NanoApostle is a solid runner-up. Possibly I might even like it more than Furi. I'm not sure. I just played this game the other day, and I was thoroughly impressed by it. And this game is actually kind of similar to Furi. You got another top-down action game with a mix of both melee and twin-stick shooting here. But this game follows a much more by-the-books kind of design. It's much less projectile-focused than Furi is, it's much more melee-oriented, and the basics are you got a simple attack, you got a parry, and you got an invincible dodge. Very basic stuff, and unlike Furi, most attacks in this game can be parried, except for the occasional, like, red exclamation mark, unparryable attack, you gotta dodge it. Kinda like a Sekiro kind of deal. And honestly, when I see games like this, that's kind of a red flag to me, because like I said, I've played a lot of these kinds of games, and they all feel kind of samey, and usually a lot of them don't really have much more going on than that. But thankfully, NanoApostle is not a game with that problem. This game's actually pretty sick. For one, this game is really fast-paced and really hard, so just that alone makes it work pretty well. Like, these bosses are throwing out constant attacks that you need to be parrying or dodging or whatever. And the timings in this game are a little stricter than you find in a lot of other games like this, so that helps to force you to really lock in and get serious. But another thing is that the bosses do throw out a lot of unblockable attacks, so it's not just like parry, 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 dodge, parry, 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 dodge. You do have to do quite a bit of both, and identifying which attacks you can parry, which ones you can't. You know, it adds a little something something to it. But the real star of the show in NanoApostle is the offense. You have that meter in the top left, and when it fills, you can do a projectile attack. landing that on the boss puts this mark on them. You can see it appear above their health bar, that little diamond there, and landing attacks will fill up that diamond. When it fills all the way, then it'll essentially burst and do a big chunk of damage and heal the player a little bit. So that's kind of cool, but ultimately doesn't really affect how you play that much. You know, attack, dodge, land some projectiles when your meter fills, and you'll just get extra damage and healing basically for free. But then you start to get into the game's skill system. You get a bunch of perks and slots, and you can try to make your build to fit how you want to approach the game. Like, if you find the game really challenging, you can make it easier, make yourself take less damage, give you more healing, that kind of thing. Or you can go glass cannon style with it, where you get a bunch of extra damage, but taking hits or healing or whatever will temporarily negate those buffs. So if you can avoid hits at all, then you can kill the bosses really quickly. But I personally went for a build that was entirely focused on this mark system that made it a lot more interesting to play. I used some perks that made it that I gained more meter when landing attacks on the boss, and also got meter when parrying, because you do that constantly, so I had more meter to work with. I could land more projectiles, put more marks on the boss, but then you also unlock this charge attack in the game that does a lot of damage and also gives you access to this counter move. How about I throw in a perk that makes landing that also put a mark on the boss? And then how about something that lets me charge my projectile attack, and when it's charged, it puts 2 marks on the boss. But on top of that, you can make the startup of your projectile charge another parry, and using it will instantly set it to a 2-mark attack. So now I'm throwing tons of marks on the boss, getting a bunch of extra healing and damage. But then I noticed that there is a 5-mark cap. Beyond that, you can't put any more on. So all my extra potential marks that I could be throwing on are being wasted. So I throw on another perk that if the boss has 3 marks on them and I hit them, that will instantly cash out all of them. So now I'm just rotating near constant marks on the boss and detonating them and doing so much damage, and it really makes my game plan a lot more interesting. I want to try to fit in as many charge attacks as I can. I want to keep my eye on my meter, go for projectile parries, charge up the projectiles when I see opportunities. It made this whole thing way more interesting, and you throw that on top of these really aggressive bosses with so much parrying and dodging going on. Friggin' awesome, man. This game is so much fun, but again, it's really hard, so go in knowing that it's gonna be a serious challenge. And I know the anime style might not be to everyone's liking, but it's certainly to mine, and I actually really dig the whole, like, vibe and feel and atmosphere of this game, and even the story, believe it or not. It's a simple little thing, but I found it very pleasant and very nice. It fits with the game really well, and it's kind of my jam. I'm a big fan of stories that have this kind of tone where it's sort of like lonely and somber, but has some heart to it. Like, if you're a big fan of, like, quiet apocalypse stuff where it's just, like, couple of characters just dealing with some kind of small-scale situation, like a girl's last tour or something like that, that's the kind of vibe you get here, and I really like that sort of thing. So, yeah, I really enjoyed NanoApostle in pretty much every way. It was a total shock. I didn't know anything about this game. Seems like it really flew under the radar, but it is solid. Do not sleep on this game. It's really, really good. And in general, don't sleep on any of these games, because they're all really solid. It's not too surprising that this is kind of a rare subcategory of game, because bosses are a lot of time investment to make, and you don't get that much game out of the work that goes into it. But I'd say generally it seems to pay off. Most of these games seem to be really good, so hey, if there are any more cool boss battler games out there, let me know, and maybe I'll cover them in the future. Who knows? I hope you enjoyed this boss rush of boss rush games, and I hope to see you again for even more recommendations of games just as cool as these.